March 6, 1944. High above the clouds over Berlin, Luftwaffe Major Werner Schroer climbed desperately toward his maximum ceiling. His Messerschmitt Bf 109G struggled in the thin air as he pushed the aircraft beyond 35,000 feet. The engine wheezed and coughed, starved of oxygen at this extreme altitude. Then he heard a sound that chilled the blood of every German fighter pilot on the Eastern Front. The distinctive roar of Packard-built Merlin engines, operating efficiently in air so thin his own supercharger had all but surrendered. Schroer's earphones crackled with panicked transmissions from other pilots. "Mustangs! They're over the city!" Another voice, higher pitched with alarm. "Impossible! They can't reach Berlin!" But the unmistakable silhouettes proved otherwise. North American P-51 Mustangs, escorting American bombers all the way to the heart of the Reich. In that moment, as American fighters danced gracefully through air, too thin for his own aircraft to maneuver effectively, Schroer realized a terrible truth. The sanctuary of altitude, the one advantage that had protected German cities from sustained daylight bombing, was gone forever. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. The story of how the Merlin engine transformed the P-51 Mustang into a war-winning weapon began not with American innovation, but with British desperation. In the dark days of 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with an urgent request: build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks for the Royal Air Force. Instead, NAA President Dutch Kindelberger made an audacious counteroffer. He would design and deliver a completely new fighter in just 120 days. True to his word, on October 26, 1940, the first Mustang prototype took flight, a mere 117 days after contract signing. The aircraft showed tremendous promise, with exceptional low-altitude performance and remarkable aerodynamic efficiency. Its low-drag laminar flow wing delivered speed that outclassed many contemporary fighters. Yet, despite these advantages, the early Allison-powered Mustangs revealed a critical weakness. Their performance deteriorated dramatically above 15,000 feet, precisely where strategic bombing operations needed to take place. This altitude limitation relegated early Mustangs to low-level tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles. Meanwhile, American bomber crews flying daylight missions over Germany faced a grim reality. Without effective fighter escort all the way to their targets and back, losses mounted to unsustainable levels. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids of August and October 1943 saw bomber losses exceed 20%, a rate that would exhaust even America's vast industrial capacity if sustained. Something had to change. That change came through the marriage of American airframe engineering with British engine technology. In 1942, engineers at Rolls-Royce suggested fitting their Merlin 61 engine to the Mustang. This wasn't just another engine, it was a mechanical masterpiece featuring a two-stage, two-speed supercharger with intercooling that maintained power at extreme altitudes where other engines faltered and failed. When test pilot Ronnie Harker first flew a Merlin-powered Mustang at Rolls-Royce's Hucknall Airfield in England, the results were nothing short of revolutionary. The aircraft's speed at 30,000 feet increased by nearly 100 miles per hour, transforming it from an adequate low-altitude fighter into a high-altitude thoroughbred with the range to reach Berlin and beyond. "This aircraft will do exactly what we need," Harker reported, barely containing his excitement. "It will change the entire strategic situation." Production of Merlin-powered P-51B and C models began in earnest by mid-1943. These aircraft would soon earn the nickname the Cadillac of the skies from grateful bomber crews. But for the Luftwaffe pilots who had to face them, they represented something else entirely, an existential threat that could pursue them to altitudes previously considered safe havens. German pilots had become accustomed to fighting at altitudes where their Bf-109s and FW-190s maintained reasonable performance, typically below 25,000 feet. The arrival of Merlin-powered Mustangs eliminated this sanctuary. Günter Roll, who would end the war as Germany's third highest scoring ace with 275 victories, later recalled his first encounter with the Merlin Mustang. "We were climbing to attack bombers when we heard them first, that distinctive engine sound carrying through thin air. My wingman said it was impossible. No American fighter had the range to reach us. Then they appeared, above us, with plenty of fuel and energy to fight. That day I knew something fundamental had changed." The transformation became devastatingly clear to the Luftwaffe during the first major daylight raids on Berlin in early March 1944. Nearly 700 American heavy bombers, escorted by P-51's throughout the mission, struck the German capital. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the formation. Over 75 bombers were shot down in what became known as Black Monday to American air crews, but the Merlin Mustangs exacted a terrible toll on German defenders. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, who headed German fighter forces, recognized the strategic turning point immediately. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "When I heard the first reports of American fighters over Berlin, I realized the Luftwaffe had lost the air war. The Mustang was not just another fighter. With that engine, it represented something we had deemed impossible, a single-engine fighter with the range to escort bombers to our most distant targets, with the altitude performance to meet our best aircraft on equal or superior terms." The Packard Merlin engine, American-built under license from Rolls-Royce, transformed the Mustang into the ultimate high-altitude predator. The engine's sophisticated two-stage supercharging system efficiently compressed the thin upper atmosphere, feeding the engine with dense air at altitudes where German fighters struggled to breathe. This translated into sustained power above 30,000 feet, giving P-51 pilots a decisive advantage where it mattered most at the altitudes where American heavy bombers operated. German test pilot Hans Fay, who flew a captured P-51 extensively as part of the Luftwaffe's aircraft evaluation program, wrote in his classified report, "The Mustang's rate of climb is exceptional at all altitudes. But what truly distinguishes this aircraft is its ability to maintain power and control responsiveness at extreme heights. Above 30,000 feet, where our engines lose significant power and our controls become sluggish, the P-51 continues to accelerate, turn, and climb with little apparent effort. This represents an advantage we cannot counter with current technology. For Luftwaffe pilots, the sound of Merlin engines above 35,000 feet became a harbinger of doom-audible evidence that the air war had fundamentally shifted. The once mighty German air defense system, which had successfully repelled unescorted daylight bombing raids throughout 1943, now faced an opponent that could not only match but exceed the performance of their best fighters precisely where the bombers flew. The psychological impact was devastating. Luftwaffe pilots developed a bitter saying, "When you hear the Mustang's Merlin at maximum altitude, you know the Americans own the sky." This wasn't mere defeatism, it was a stark recognition of technical reality. The combination of the Mustang's aerodynamically efficient airframe and the Merlin's high-altitude performance created an aircraft that could operate effectively in the stratosphere, where the air was too thin for most piston-engine fighters to function properly. This capability proved decisive in the Battle of Berlin, a series of massive daylight raids against the German capital in early 1944. For the first time, American bombers could strike the heart of the Reich with fighter escort throughout their mission. As Hermann Goering later admitted during post-war interrogation, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." The technical aspects of this high-altitude superiority deserve closer examination. The Merlin 61 engine featured in the P-51B and C models utilized a two-stage supercharging system. The first stage compressed incoming air, which was then cooled in an intercooler, before being further compressed in a second stage and fed into the engine. This complex but effective system allowed the engine to produce approximately 1,500 horsepower at altitudes where the German Daimler-Benz and BMW engines struggled to generate half that power. This power differential translated directly into combat advantage. When Luftwaffe pilots attempted to climb to bomber altitude, they found themselves at a severe energy disadvantage. Their aircraft accelerated slowly, climbed sluggishly, and maneuvered poorly in the thin air. Mustang pilots, by contrast, operated their aircraft near peak performance, enabling them to dictate the terms of engagement. They could choose when to fight, how to fight, and most importantly, when to disengage. Walter Krupinski, a Luftwaffe ace with 197 victories, described the frustration. Fighting Mustangs at high altitude was like swimming against a strong current. Everything required more effort for us, climbing, turning, accelerating while they seemed to move effortlessly. You could be in a perfectly good tactical position, then suddenly find yourself defensive because your aircraft simply couldn't maintain energy in the thin air. The psychological dimension of this technical disparity cannot be overstated. German pilots, once confident in their aircraft and tactics, now found themselves outmatched in capabilities that mattered most. Combat reports from early 1944 frequently mention Luftwaffe pilots refusing to engage Mustangs above 30,000 feet, preferring instead to wait for American formations to descend to more favorable altitudes. This concession of the high ground represented a fundamental shift in air combat dynamics over Europe. Major Hans-Joachim Marseille, one of Germany's most skilled fighter pilots, wrote in his last combat report before his death, "The Americans have achieved what we thought. Impossible, they've brought a fighter to Berlin with fuel to fight and return home. More concerning is that at bombing altitudes, their aircraft performs better than ours. We must either develop new tactics or new technology to counter this threat." The technical challenge proved insurmountable for the Luftwaffe. Germany's aviation industry, already strained by material shortages and increasingly effective Allied bombing, could not develop and field a high-altitude fighter capable of matching the Mustang in sufficient numbers. The Me-109K and FW-190D models offered improved high-altitude performance, but arrived too late and in quantities too small to alter the strategic balance. Instead, the Luftwaffe attempted to adapt tactically. Pilots were instructed to avoid extended engagements with Mustangs above 25,000 feet. German fighter groups concentrated their attacks, striking in large formations before quickly disengaging rather than becoming entangled in protracted dogfights where their aircraft's limitations would prove decisive. These tactics, while reducing losses, also reduced effectiveness against bomber formations, exactly the strategic outcome Allied planners sought. Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded fighter groups on both the eastern and western fronts, later reflected, "The Mustang's arrival at Berlin altitude represented a threshold we could not cross with existing technology. We could either risk our pilots in unfavorable combat conditions or concede control of the upper air. Neither option offered a path to victory." This high-altitude dominance had immediate operational consequences. By April 1944, American bombers struck targets throughout Germany with markedly reduced losses. The 8th Air Force, which had been forced to suspend deep penetration raids in October 1943 due to unsustainable casualties, now routinely dispatched missions to the most distant German industrial targets. The strategic bombing campaign, previously limited by escort range, now reached its full potential. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The broader strategic implications became clear during Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, in February 1944. American and British bombers struck German aircraft factories in a coordinated offensive designed not just to reduce production capacity, but to force the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle. The Merlin Mustangs played the crucial role, escorting bombers while simultaneously hunting German fighters wherever they could be found. German records tell the story in stark numerical terms. During the week of February 20th through 25th, 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 300 fighter aircraft and, more irreplaceably, nearly 200 experienced pilots. These losses came at a time when German flight schools, hampered by fuel shortages, could not produce skilled replacements in sufficient numbers. The Luftwaffe began a death spiral, from which it would never recover. The P-51's high-altitude performance contributed to this outcome in multiple ways. Most obviously, it allowed bomber formations to receive escort throughout their missions, reducing losses and enabling more frequent operations. Less visibly, but perhaps more importantly, it forced the Luftwaffe to fight at altitudes where their aircraft performed poorly, increasing German losses and accelerating pilot attrition. Luftwaffe records from March and April 1944 document an increasing reluctance among German pilots to engage Mustangs above 30,000 feet. One Luftwaffe group commander wrote in his after-action report, "When American formations approach with Mustang escort at maximum altitude, our pilots face a no-win situation. If they climb to meet the threat, they fight with severe performance disadvantages. If they remain at lower altitude, they cede control of the airspace and allow bombers to operate unmolested." The sounds of the air war changed as well. German civilians in Berlin and other major cities had grown accustomed to hearing the distinctive drone of bomber formations, followed by the higher-pitched scream of defending Bf 109 and 4190 engines. By March 1944, they began reporting a new sound, the deeper, more resonant roar of Merlin engines at extreme altitude, often preceding the bombers themselves. This acoustic harbinger of destruction became so recognizable that German air raid warnings sometimes went out based on engine sounds alone, even before aircraft appeared on radar. For American bomber crews, the psychological impact worked in reverse. Captain James Howard, who would receive the Medal of Honor for single-handedly defending a bomber formation against 30 German fighters, described the morale boost. "When you're flying at 30,000 feet over enemy territory, the sound of those Merlin engines approaching is better than any symphony. The Mustangs didn't just escort us, they gave us confidence that we could complete our mission and return home." The technical achievement represented by the Merlin Mustang combination was recognized even by those tasked with defeating it. German aircraft designer Willy Messerschmitt, whose Bf 109 fighters formed the backbone of the Luftwaffe, grudgingly acknowledged the achievement. "The Americans solved a problem we believed unsolvable, creating a single-engine fighter with both exceptional high-altitude performance and the range to escort bombers to our furthest cities." This represented not just engineering skill but strategic vision. By June 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the Normandy landings, the battle for air superiority had already been decisively won. The Luftwaffe had lost over 2,000 fighter pilots since January, with training programs unable to produce replacements of comparable skill. German aircraft production actually increased during this period, thanks to Albert Speer's reorganization of the aviation industry. But without trained pilots to fly them, new aircraft provided little combat capability. On D-Day itself, the Luftwaffe managed only 200 sorties over Normandy, compared to over 14,000 by Allied air forces. This collapse in German air capability stemmed directly from the war of attrition forced upon them by Merlin Mustangs operating at altitudes where German fighters could not effectively respond. The sound of Merlins at 35,000 feet had been the death knell for the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. For German civilians, the consequences were dire. Cities that had previously experienced only night bombing now faced round-the-clock attacks. Wolfgang Samuel, then a child in Berlin, later recalled, "The air raids became constant. We barely emerged from night shelters after RAF attacks before the sirens would sound again for the Americans. There seemed to be nowhere to hide and no respite. The sound of those fighter engines above the bombers told us the Americans could now reach us any time they chose." The technical evolution of the Merlin Mustang continued through 1944. The definitive P-51D model featured a bubble canopy for improved visibility, 6 50-caliber machine guns for increased firepower, and the even more powerful Packard-built 1657 engine, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, with further refinements for high-altitude operations. These improvements extended the aircraft's already impressive performance envelope, allowing effective operations above 40,000 feet. Luftwaffe records document increasing desperation in the face of this evolving threat. By mid-1944, German fighter tactics had been reduced to opportunistic attacks brief, high-speed passes through bomber formations when Mustang escorts were temporarily distracted. Even Germany's elite fighter units found themselves unable to effectively challenge Mustang-escorted bomber streams without prohibitive losses. The culmination of the Merlin Mustang's impact came during Operation Argument, the coordinated bombing campaign against Germany's aviation industry in February 1944. Over 1 week of intensive operations, the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command struck aircraft factories throughout the Reich. The Luftwaffe rose to defend these critical facilities, but found itself outmatched not just in numbers, but in critical performance metrics at combat altitude. Adolf Galland later wrote, "The week in February 1944 was when we lost the air war decisively. We sent up everything we had, our best pilots in our best machines, and still could not effectively defend our own aircraft factories. The Americans dominated the high-altitude airspace completely. Their Mustangs were not just escorting bombers, they were hunting our fighters wherever they could be found." The technical foundations of this dominance lay in the remarkable engineering of both airframe and engine. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, a revolutionary design that reduced drag by maintaining smooth airflow across much of the wing surface, proved particularly effective at high altitudes, where air density was lower. Combined with the Merlin's superb high-altitude performance, this created an aircraft that actually improved its relative advantage over opponents as altitude increased. German test pilot Heinrich Beauvais, who evaluated a captured P-51, noted this unique characteristic. Most fighters show degraded performance as altitude increases. The Mustang demonstrates the opposite tendency. Its performance advantage over our aircraft actually expands above 30,000 feet. This creates a tactical situation where our pilots must fight at an increasingly severe disadvantage the higher the engagement occurs. For Luftwaffe pilots, this realization came too late to develop effective countermeasures. By the time the full implications of the Merlin Mustang's capabilities became clear in early 1944, Germany lacked the industrial capacity, raw materials, and fuel to develop and field a comparable high-altitude fighter in sufficient numbers. The Me-2 jet fighter offered superior speed, but suffered from poor reliability, limited range, and vulnerability during takeoff and landing. It represented a technological leap, but not a strategic solution. As 1944 progressed, the psychological impact of American air superiority spread throughout the German military and civilian population. Intercepted communications reveal a growing fatalism among Luftwaffe pilots assigned to intercept Mustang-escorted formations. One pilot radio transmission, recorded by Allied intelligence in April 1944, captured this sentiment. "They're above 35,000 feet again. We can't reach them effectively. Request permission to engage only if they descend to our altitude." This reluctance to engage at maximum altitude represented a complete reversal from earlier phases of the air war, when German fighters had actively sought combat with unescorted bombers. The sound of Merlin engines operating efficiently in the thin upper atmosphere had become a symbol of technological superiority that demoralized even the most committed defenders. For American bomber crews, who had once faced loss rates that made completing a 25-mission tour statistically unlikely, the Merlin Mustang's arrival transformed their war experience. Technical Sergeant Walter Thompson, a B-17 Bull turret gunner, described the difference. "Before the P-51's, crossing into German airspace felt like a death sentence. After they arrived with those Merlins, we still faced danger, but there was new confidence. When you heard those engines above you at 35,000 feet, you knew you had guardians that could take the fight to the enemy anywhere in the sky." The ultimate vindication came in March 1944, when Mustangs escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and beyond. The sound of American fighters over the German capital, a city previously considered beyond the reach of single-engine escort fighters, represented not just a tactical achievement, but a strategic watershed. As Hermann Göring famously told his staff when informed of Mustangs over Berlin, "The war is over. The Americans own our skies." The technical triumph of the Merlin Mustang combination represented more than just exceptional engineering. It demonstrated the power of international collaboration and industrial might. British engine technology, American airframe design, and mass production capabilities combined to create a weapon system that fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the air war over Europe. The distinctive roar of Merlin engines at 35,000 feet became the acoustic signature of this decisive shift. A sound that told German defenders and American bomber crews alike that the air war had entered its final phase. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Colonel William Risley stood on the tarmac of Bodney Airfield in Norfolk as an exhausted pilot climbed down from his battered P-51. The young man's face was streaked with sweat and oil, his eyes hollow from the strain of an 8-hour mission deep into the Reich. "How many today, Johnson?" Risley asked quietly. The pilot looked up, his expression unreadable. 3 109s over Leipzig, but we lost Phillips and Martinez." He paused, then added in a voice barely above a whisper, "The Krauts are sending up kids now, Colonel. One couldn't have been more than 17. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe's desperate circumstances had become apparent to everyone. With fuel reserves dwindling and experienced pilots lost at an unsustainable rate, Germany resorted to deploying half-trained teenagers in fighter aircraft against the world's most formidable air force. The elite cadres of Luftwaffe veterans, who had dominated European skies in 1940, had been systematically destroyed, replaced by raw recruits with fewer than 50 hours of flight time, many of whom had never practiced aerial gunnery before facing American fighters. Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war, wrote in his diary, "Our replacement pilots arrive with increasingly minimal training. Yesterday, a boy joined my squadron who had never fired his guns in flight. His first combat was his last. The Americans are killing an entire generation of German youth in the skies over our homeland. Not just experienced pilots, but the instructors and trainees who should have rebuilt our air force after the war. The human tragedy unfolding within the Luftwaffe represented the culmination of strategic choices made years earlier. Germany had begun the war with a tactical air force designed for supporting ground operations, not for sustaining a prolonged strategic air war. When that strategic conflict materialized, the Luftwaffe found itself without the industrial base, pilot training capacity, or fuel reserves to compete with American production. The Merlin-powered Mustang, arriving in theatre just as German resources approached their breaking point, delivered the knockout blow to an already staggering opponent. This technical and industrial mismatch manifested in the most human of terms. By June 1944, the average Luftwaffe pilot reached the front with less than 180 hours of flight time compared to over 400 hours for his American counterpart. German pilot life expectancy after reaching. Operational units dropped from months to weeks and eventually to days. Training accidents increased dramatically as fuel shortages curtailed practice flights, sending ever more poorly prepared pilots into combat against seasoned American fighters. Former Luftwaffe instructor Johannes Kaufmann recalled with bitterness, "We were sending children to die." In 1943, we still maintained proper training programs. By mid-1944, we were rushing students through abbreviated courses with barely enough flying hours to master basic control of their aircraft. When they encountered Mustangs at altitude, the result was predictable and devastating. It wasn't combat, it was slaughter. The technical sophistication of the Merlin engine represented more than just engineering achievement. It embodied the fundamental difference between American and German approaches to warfare. The Merlin 61 that transformed the Mustang required approximately 5,000 man-hours to produce. Its complexity with a two-stage supercharger, intercooling system, and precision tolerances throughout demanded skilled labor, abundant raw materials, and sophisticated machine tools. American industry scaled this complex manufacturing challenge to produce these engines by the thousands without compromising quality. Germany, meanwhile, found itself unable to mass-produce even the simpler engines that powered its Bf 109 and Fw 190 fighters with consistent reliability. Material shortages forced substitutions that compromised performance, dispersed production facilities, necessary to avoid Allied bombing but inefficient compared to concentrated factories, further reduced output. The disparity in industrial capacity that allowed America to mass-produce sophisticated engines, while Germany struggled with simpler designs, encapsulated the true nature of the conflict, a war of production that Germany could not win. The industrial advantage manifested most clearly in the skies over Berlin during Operation Argument in February 1944. Nearly 1,000 American heavy bombers struck aircraft factories across Germany, escorted by hundreds of Merlin-powered Mustangs operating at altitudes where German fighters struggled to respond effectively. German production miraculously recovered, thanks to Albert Speer's reorganization of the aviation industry. But the Luftwaffe's pilot corps, decimated during those critical weeks, proved irreplaceable. Lieutenant Franz Weber, one of the few German pilots who survived this period, later described the psychological impact. "We knew the Americans could reach anywhere in the Reich with their fighters. There was no sanctuary, no safe altitude, no target beyond their reach. When Mustangs appeared over Berlin, operating effectively above 35,000 feet, we realized the technological gap had become unbridgeable. Some pilots began refusing high-altitude intercept missions, knowing they faced an opponent with every advantage and little chance of survival." The sound of Merlin engines at extreme altitude became a psychological weapon that affected German civilian morale as well. Air raid sirens might be ignored during daytime hours when unescorted bombers rarely appeared, but the distinctive roar of Packard-built Merlins operating efficiently in the stratosphere triggered immediate responses. German civilians learned to identify American fighter engine sounds as reliably as their own Daimler-Benz and BMW power plants. The knowledge that enemy fighters could operate freely over their cities, at altitudes where German defenders struggled, created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Irony permeated the Mustang story. An aircraft designed to British specifications, powered by a British engine, became the quintessential American fighter of World War II. The P-51 might never have reached its potential without the Merlin, while the Merlin might never have achieved mass production without American manufacturing prowess. This international collaboration created a weapon system greater than either nation could have developed alone, a partnership that represented the broader Allied cooperation essential to victory. Further irony lay in the Mustang's troubled development path. The aircraft that ultimately secured Allied air superiority almost never reached production in meaningful numbers. The U.S. Army Air Forces initially showed little interest in the type, focusing instead on the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Only persistent advocacy by a few far-sighted officers, particularly Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, kept the Mustang program alive until its potential could be fully realized. Hitchcock, a former World War I fighter pilot and renowned polo player, became the Mustang's most effective champion after witnessing test flights of the Merlin-powered prototype. His reports to Washington emphasized the aircraft's revolutionary performance at high altitude and its game-changing strategic implications. Without his advocacy, the Mustang might have remained a limited production reconnaissance aircraft rather than the decisive weapon it became. Tragically, Hitchcock would not live to see his vision fully realized. He died in a Mustang crash in April 1944, just as the aircraft was turning the tide of the air war. The human dimension of the Merlin Mustang's impact extended to thousands of American bomber crewmen who survived missions that would have been suicidal without fighter escort. B-17 and B-24 bombers, operating without effective fighter protection, had suffered loss rates exceeding 20% on deep penetration raids into Germany during 1943. With Mustang Escort, these rates dropped to sustainable levels, typically 5 to 8%, allowing the strategic bombing campaign to continue uninterrupted. Jack Coleman, a B-17 radio operator who completed 30 missions over Germany, captured the sentiment of many bomber crews. Before the Mustangs, we flew alone once our escorts turned back. We'd count the minutes until we crossed back into friendly airspace, watching our formation get smaller as planes went down around us. After the Mustangs arrived, everything changed. They stayed with us all the way to Berlin and back. The difference between despair and hope was the sound of those Merlin engines above us. The technological advantage provided by the Merlin engine reverberated throughout the strategic air campaign. American bombers could now operate with reduced losses, allowing commanders to maintain pressure on German industry despite inevitable casualties. This persistence proved decisive. German production recovered impressively from individual raids, but the cumulative effect of sustained bombing campaigns severely disrupted industrial output, transportation networks, and most critically, fuel production. By September 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel plants had been systematically targeted by Mustang-escorted heavy bombers, reducing output by nearly 90%. The resulting fuel famine crippled not only the Luftwaffe, but the entire German war machine. Training programs ground to a virtual halt, as aviation fuel was reserved for frontline units. Ground forces found their mobility increasingly restricted. Even the vaunted new jet fighters, technically superior to any Allied piston-engine aircraft, frequently sat grounded for lack of fuel. Luftwaffe Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, who later became a general in post-war West Germany's Air Force, observed, "The Americans focused their strategy perfectly. By targeting our fuel production with raids we could not effectively oppose, they ensured that even the aircraft we managed to produce often couldn't fly. Our newer pilots received minimal training before combat. Our operational squadrons flew fewer sorties, and our technological advantages, like the Me-262 jet, couldn't be employed effectively. The Mustang didn't just win battles, it systematically dismantled our ability to wage air war." The human cost extended beyond those directly engaged in combat. German civilians found themselves increasingly defenseless as their fighter force deteriorated. Allied bombing raids, once conducted primarily at night by the RAF to avoid prohibitive daylight losses, now struck around the clock. American precision daylight attacks targeted specific industrial facilities, while British area bombing at night devastated urban centres. For those on the ground, the distinctive sound of Merlin engines overhead signalled that nowhere in the Reich remained truly safe. Marie Schmidt, a Berlin resident who survived the war, later recalled, "We learned to distinguish different aircraft by their engine sounds. The deep, resonant roar of Mustangs was unlike anything in the Luftwaffe. When we heard them arriving ahead of the bombers, we knew the raid would be particularly devastating because our fighters couldn't protect us effectively. Those American engines sounded different, more powerful, more confident, and we understood what that meant for our future." American pilots flying Merlin Mustangs experienced transformation as well. Fighter tactics evolved rapidly as pilots recognized their aircraft's capabilities. Earlier fighter escorts had flown close formation with bombers, sacrificing their performance advantage for proximity to the bombers they protected. With the P-51's arrival, General Jimmy Doolittle implemented a fundamental tactical shift. Mustang pilots were instructed to seek out and destroy German fighters wherever they could be found, rather than remaining tethered to bomber formations. This aggressive doctrine capitalized on the Mustang's performance advantages at high altitude, while simultaneously addressing the strategic objective air superiority, rather than merely bomber protection. By hunting Luftwaffe fighters during their assembly and approach, Mustang groups prevented effective attacks on bomber formations, while systematically destroying Germany's irreplaceable cadre of experienced pilots. The transformation from defensive to offensive fighter employment represented a conceptual breakthrough as significant as the technical achievement of the Merlin Mustang combination itself. Don Gentile, who became one of America's highest-scoring aces flying P-51's with the 4th Fighter Group, expressed this tactical evolution. With the Mustang, we stopped waiting for them to come to us. We went hunting for them over their airfields, during their assembly, wherever we could find them. The aircraft gave us the range and altitude performance to take the fight deep into Germany and maintain our advantage throughout the engagement. We weren't escorts anymore, we were predators. The statistical impact of this tactical shift was dramatic. Between January and April 1944, American fighters shot down over 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft while losing fewer than 300 of their own. This 4-to-1 exchange ratio, coupled with Germany's inability to replace experienced pilots, accelerated the Luftwaffe's decline from formidable opponent to ineffective force. By summer 1944, many German units had effectively ceased operations due to aircraft shortages, fuel limitations, and inadequate pilot replacement. Werner Mölders, the Luftwaffe's first ace to claim 100 victories and the architect of many German fighter tactics, had predicted this outcome before his death in 1941. In his final tactical assessment, he warned, "If the Americans ever develop a long-range fighter with performance equal to our best aircraft, we will face a situation where numerical inferiority becomes catastrophic, rather than merely challenging. Our entire defensive concept depends on engaging bombers without facing equal or superior escort fighters throughout German airspace." His prophecy materialized exactly as feared. The Merlin Mustang combination created precisely the threat Mölders had identified: a fighter, with range to reach any target in the Reich and performance to defeat German interceptors on equal or superior terms, particularly at the critical high altitudes where bomber formations operated. What Mölders could not have anticipated was the industrial disparity that allowed America to deploy these advanced fighters in overwhelming numbers, while Germany struggled to maintain basic force levels. The impact extended beyond the European theatre. As Luftwaffe effectiveness collapsed in early 1944, German ground forces lost the air support that had been central to Blitzkrieg doctrine since 1939. D-Day landings in Normandy took place under complete Allied air supremacy, with German forces unable to move in daylight without facing devastating air attacks. The strategic bombing campaign, enabled by Mustang escorts, systematically targeted transportation networks that might have allowed German reinforcements to reach the invasion beaches. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with defending the Atlantic Wall, wrote to his wife shortly before the invasion, "The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There's simply no answer to it." This assessment from Germany's most respected field commander reflected the strategic culmination of the Merlin Mustang's impact, complete Allied control of the air that shaped all subsequent ground operations through the final phases of the war. Perhaps the most profound transformation occurred within the German High Command itself. The Luftwaffe had begun the war with an offensive mindset, designed around supporting army operations through tactical air superiority and battlefield interdiction. By 1944, it had been forced into an entirely defensive posture, desperately trying to protect German cities and industry from increasingly effective Allied bombing. This fundamental shift in mission reflected not just changing fortunes, but an existential crisis for the entire German military establishment. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's designated successor and the proud architect of the Luftwaffe, found himself increasingly marginalized as his promises of effective air defense proved hollow. In a January 1944 meeting with fighter commanders, he famously erupted when told that Mustangs had been reported over Berlin. "That's impossible. The Americans don't have a fighter that can reach Berlin." When shown evidence contradicting this claim, Göring reportedly fell silent before muttering, "Then we have lost the war." The sound of Merlin engines at 35,000 feet had rendered his assurances meaningless. The technical superiority embodied in the Merlin Mustang revealed deeper truths about the nature of modern warfare. Germany had entered the conflict with tactical brilliance, experienced leadership, and sophisticated doctrine advantages that delivered spectacular early victories. America entered with industrial might, technical innovation, and vast natural resources. As the war progressed, Germany's initial advantages proved fleeting, while America's fundamental strengths grew increasingly decisive. The Merlin Mustang represented this strategic reality in its most concentrated form. American fighter pilot Bud Anderson, who scored over 16 victories flying P-51's with the 363rd Fighter Group, reflected on this disparity decades later. "We never worried about replacing lost aircraft. A new Mustang would arrive before the paperwork for the lost one was completed." German pilots faced a completely different reality. Each aircraft lost represented an increasingly irreplaceable asset. This fundamental difference affected everything from tactics to morale. We could afford to be aggressive because our industrial base supported us. They became increasingly conservative as their resources dwindled. The human dimension of this industrial disparity manifested in the lives of pilots on both sides. American fighter pilots rotated home after completing combat tours, typically 300 combat hours or 75 missions. Their experience informed training programs and tactical development, creating a continuous improvement cycle. German pilots, by contrast, flew until death, serious injury, or complete physical exhaustion removed them from combat. As one Luftwaffe squadron commander grimly observed, "Our only rotation policy is to the cemetery or hospital." This difference in human resource management proved as decisive as any technical advantage. By preserving experienced pilots through rotation policies, American fighter units maintained effectiveness while building a reservoir of combat veterans for training and leadership roles. The Luftwaffe, forcing its pilots to fly until they could fight no more, systematically destroyed its own expertise base. The sound of Merlin engines over Berlin represented not just technical superiority, but a fundamentally more sustainable approach to warfare itself. As Allied armies advanced into Germany in early 1945, they discovered concrete evidence of the Luftwaffe's collapse. Hundreds of brand-new fighter aircraft stood abandoned on airfields, many with empty fuel tanks or missing critical components. More telling were the pilot logbooks found in deserted ready rooms. Training hours had decreased from over 200 hours in 1940 to less than 100 by 1944, and barely 50 hours by war's end. The final entries often showed pilots with minimal experience flying complex fighter aircraft directly into combat against veteran American opponents. The cruel mathematics of attrition had played out exactly as Allied strategists hoped. Air superiority, won through the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe fighter force, enabled ground advances that captured the very airfields, factories, and training facilities necessary to rebuild that force. The cycle of decline became self-reinforcing and ultimately irreversible. The Merlin Mustang, arriving at the critical moment when this process began, accelerated Germany's aerial collapse beyond recovery. In the final analysis, the sound of Merlin engines at 35,000 feet represented more than just American technical achievement or Allied industrial might. It embodied the fundamental transformation of warfare from an endeavor decided primarily by tactical brilliance and individual heroism to one determined by production capacity, technical innovation, and systemic approach. Germany might produce exceptional pilots and engineers, but America created exceptional production systems that delivered technological superiority in overwhelming numbers. The legacy of the Merlin Mustang extended far beyond World War II. Its development path, international collaboration, emphasis on range and high-altitude performance, focus on escort rather than pure interceptor capabilities, influenced fighter design for generations. More broadly, the strategic lessons learned through its employment shaped air power doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond. The recognition that air superiority forms the essential foundation for all other military operations remains central to modern warfare. For those who experienced it directly, however, the Merlin Mustang's impact remained intensely personal. German civilians who heard its distinctive engine note overhead knew their air defense system had failed them. Luftwaffe pilots who engaged Mustangs at high altitude understood the technological gap they could not overcome. American bomber crews who saw P-51's arriving over distant targets felt renewed hope in their survival. And fighter pilots on both sides recognized that the air war had fundamentally changed with the arrival of an aircraft that could reach any target, fight effectively at any altitude, and return safely to base. The final irony may be that an engine designed in Derby, England, powering an airframe created in California, assembled in factories from Dallas to Inglewood, delivered the decisive advantage in a global conflict. The Merlin's distinctive roar at 35,000 feet, a sound that chilled Luftwaffe pilots and reassured bomber crews, embodied the international cooperation and industrial mobilization that ultimately proved insurmountable. When Hermann Goering heard that Mustangs were flying over Berlin, he recognized the sound of inevitability. American industry, technical innovation, and strategic vision had created a weapon against which Germany had no effective counter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.